Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for June 16th, 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal, Quebec. Mark, great to be here and great to be having another episode of the CX Files that I'm really excited about because we're interviewing a fellow Canadian, Natasha Rantanshi-Stein.
Well, that's great. And it's also a really interesting topic. I mean, we're focusing on the evolution of workforce management. And this is something that's really come a long way in the past couple of years since BPOs and internal captive contact centers have found that they had to create this kind of hybrid of people working at home, people partly working at home, people now back in the office. Workforce management is more important than ever.
Yeah, and this is something that Natasha touched on over the course of our chat, which I might add was very animated and quite frankly, very enlightening. I've been interested in workforce management for a long time, ever since I started my career as an analyst, going back nearly 2 decades. But something that I appreciated about the discussion with Natasha was the fact that one of the things that prompted her to found the company Surfboard was the fact that workforce planning solutions just weren't hitting the target in terms of what the actual CX industry of 2022 requires. As Natasha put it, in order to actually implement one of these solutions into a contact center, it takes a tremendous amount of effort. It takes a tremendous amount of time. And being able to get up and running and get used to these solutions requires almost a PhD in computer science. The approach that she takes to this and her company takes to it is not even around workforce management. It's, as she calls it, team planning and being able to focus the team on a whole series of different elements. And one of the most important elements she talks about is fairness, making sure that there's a fairness component in terms of how shifts are scheduled for individual team members and making sure that this is part of an overall strategy that drives agent satisfaction, that lowers attrition, and increases retention of good people.
I think that's a really important point. I listened to the interview and, Natasha talks about traditional workforce management. You might see people only finding out about their shifts a few days before they're scheduled to be working. And so it kind of, this creates a kind of precarious sense of employment where you never know what you're going to be doing next week. So how can you plan any family events or, the football game you want to be at or being out with friends when you don't know when your boss is going to schedule you?
This is spot on, Mark, and this is exactly the problem. And I mean, the reality is you and I have shared stories on the pod before about how we both respectively worked at Safeway when we were in high school or university. And I can recall that Safeway had a very good scheduling system. Other places didn't. And I can certainly remember instances where I would be finishing up a late shift at a video store I might be working at, finishing up at midnight, and then be expected to come back to start work at 8 a.m. the next day. Things like this just don't make sense. They didn't make sense 30 years ago. And there's no excuse in 2022 for organizations, no matter the sector, the location, or the size, to be running workforce planning in that sense. And this is where I think Surfboard and Natasha are really coming to the table with something that is obviously going to be responsive to agents, but thereby helping the enterprises or the outsourcers that are using platforms of this nature, not to mention that they're easy to use, that they're done on the basis of simplicity and being able to pull out the information that the operation managers need on an immediate basis. They can pull the information out now and have actionable data to hand, as opposed to requiring a whole team of people in some cases to pull information out that should be a straightforward process.
And just to check in with you about the CXO conference in Las Vegas this year, because it seems that Surfboard or Natasha herself would be a great guest to have there as a speaker, maybe.
Well, absolutely. We're always looking for great speakers and great participants to CX outsourcers, which, as many of your listeners, our listeners know, is happening on September 14 and 15 in Las Vegas, Nevada. We are excited. We have got a star-studded group of speakers. We've also got a tremendous number of BPO executives that are registered to come. It's selling out fast. And to our listeners, if anybody is interested in taking part in CX outsourcers, contact Mark or myself, and we'd be happy to fill you in. And as I mentioned last week, we're very delighted to announce that Mark, my co-host, will be the chairman of the event, will be moderating the event, and will do an absolutely superb job, provided we can keep him off Fremont Street the night before.
Let's hope so. Yeah, there definitely a lot happens on that street.
Well, what's the old saying? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Okay, so let's go to the interview with Natasha Rantanshi-Stein from Surfboard on team planning.
Today on the CX Files, workforce management and forecasting is in the spotlight. And to discuss this, I think, underrated but ever important trend in the CX perspective, we're very fortunate to have the founder of Surfboard, Natasha Rantanshi-Stein. Natasha, so nice to have you on the CX Files today.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. Really, really glad to be here.
So you're based in London, but you've got, for me, a very familiar accent. So why don't you share with our listening audience where you originally hail from?
Yeah, sure, Peter. I grew up in Vancouver, Canada. I've lived in London for 12 years, but somehow have not picked up the accent at all.
Well, I love hearing that Canadian accent, that West Coast accent especially. I could easily make a Vancouver Canucks joke, but I'm not going to. Being from Montreal, the Canadians came in second to last in the NHL this year, so I'm not in a position to make jokes about any professional sports team.
I wouldn't be surprised if the Canucks came last. I haven't followed since the year they made it to the finals and there were riots all over the city. That was pretty disappointing for every Vancouverite, so I lost hope.
It's all good. It's all good. sports teams are like cycles. They go up and they go down. That's my view. But talking about a cyclical industry, the CX space, I think, is probably one of the most interesting ones, and it certainly has its peaks and troughs. One of the things that you're involved with is helping organizations manage those, I guess you could say, changes in terms of volumes and to be able to predict to get as even line as possible for the purposes of planning. Sorry, very, very bad comparison there, but I couldn't resist. Look, at the end of the day, Natasha, I think a good point of reference would be to talk a little bit about Surfboard itself and how you came to start it. Because if memory serves correctly, you had a very different work background. And I'd love to find out a little bit about your journey in Surfboard and how it came about.
Yeah, sure. So just for a brief 10 seconds on what Surfboard does, we are, as you say, in the workforce management space. We prefer to call it team planning. We find those just two nicer words than workforce management, but we acknowledge that that's what the category is called. And so what that means is that we forecast the number of tickets that a customer service team can expect to receive at any point in time, and then build simple, smart, and fair schedules so that they always have enough people online to respond to those tickets within their target response time, so that customers aren't waiting a long time to get responses, but in a very balanced way. So they're not burning out their team by having, for example, the same people working late shifts or early shifts all the time, or the same people getting drained, being on phones all day, every day. I guess in terms of background, I guess I came in a pretty unconventional way. I actually started my career at Goldman Sachs in their mergers and acquisitions team, and then moved to a venture capital fund. So I spent about seven and a half years in finance and financial services. And then I got this itch to move to a company and be an operator. And at the time, there was a renewable energy company called Bulb, which was the fastest growing company in Europe. It was just reaching 1 million customers. So at the time, it was at 800,000, and really making renewable energy cheaper and simpler to access for households all across the UK, France, Spain, and Texas. And so I joined as chief of staff in April 2019. And at the time, the biggest challenge that Bulb had was scaling the customer service team. As the customer base grew, the customer service team needed to grow almost proportionally to be able to make sure that as we were signing up new customers, as customers were receiving monthly bills, as price changes were happening, as new products were being released, customers could get in contact with us about all of the above and be able to be met with delightful service. As I'm sure you've heard from many other guests on your podcast, and just having been a customer and been an entrepreneur yourself, scaling customer service is extremely hard. And that's where I effectively got helicoptered into the customer service function to start building processes around this. And what that meant was I worked with data scientists to build inflow forecasts that would tell us across the channels that we offered, so phone, email, chat, social media, how many tickets we would expect to receive at any point in time. I would then go on this website called callcenterhelper.com, and I would convert the phone volumes and the chat volumes using the Erlang model to the staffing requirements or the amount of capacity we needed to meet that demand. I'd put that back onto a spreadsheet, and then I basically had a list of who could work on the different channels, who could work on different specific types of tickets, who could work when, and then tried to create schedules on spreadsheets, meeting that inflow demand to people who could work on the different tasks and their availability. To put this in context, the team was about 75 at that point. We scaled it to 300 using the spreadsheet processes, but I'm sure you can imagine that at those numbers, it was extremely painful. And that's when the spreadsheets just really started breaking, and we were like, we need software for this. So I went out looking for workforce management software, and I guess it won't come as a surprise to you, obviously given what I'm doing now, but also possibly what you've seen previously, that I was just really disappointed that a company that was as nice to its team as we really prioritized being at Bulb, as well as being a tech company, was resorting to having to use such legacy systems that didn't really fit with our ways of working, were really difficult to onboard, and really just difficult to implement within our constructs, including just like basics like being omni-channel. And that was really the inspiration for starting Surfboard. So it was the experience of growing a team.
Well, that's fantastic. And, you touched on something right there as you were discussing what led you to launch Surfboard and the fact that you did see a gap in the market. So when you're thinking about the legacy tools that are out there for team planning or workforce management, where do you see some of these solutions maybe not cutting the mustard where they need to in terms of today's reality when it comes to CX management?
Yeah, sure. I think when we talk about Surfboard's differentiation and we are in sales conversations, we want people to walk away from those conversations with 3 words: simpler, smarter, and fairer. And I think using the reverse of those words or the opposite of those words, that's really where we see the legacy systems just aren't good enough. And so starting with simplicity, you look at using not just a legacy system, but some of the modern ones as well. And it can take 13 weeks to implement them and get them set up. They might start charging you, or they might have to build custom integrations because they don't fit with the existing systems you work in. We at Surfboard launched to market with 8 different integrations ready to go out of box, whether it's Zendesk or Customer or Front or Aircall or Twilio. Those are all ready to go, so that as soon as you set up, you're ready to start building your forecast and customizing how you want it to see. And so there's simplicity in setup. There's also simplicity in being able to use it and accessibility. That we were in a sales conversation once and somebody told us, you need a PhD in workforce management to know how to use one of the existing systems. And I think that quote really, it was extremely astute and extremely accurate, that the amount of specific training I needed to be able to understand the workforce management system that we'd implemented at Bulb. I mean, I was born in the computer era, like I am a fast typist, etc. But even then, it's super complex, really hard to implement, extremely rigid. So you end up having to customize the way you as an organization work to how that system is set up, instead of having it work alongside the way you as an organization work. In terms of being smart or intelligent, omni-channel is a piece of that. And so there's things like with chat, you need to understand how many concurrent chats an agent can handle at once. You need to be able to automate things. It's not a matter of being like just setting templates and copying and pasting those templates, because then you might as well be using a spreadsheet, because that's what you'd be doing in the spreadsheet. And so really making sure that everything is 100% automated, that you're able to customize forecasts to be able to know when there's a special event happening, have that automatically trickle down to schedules. These were all extremely manual tasks that we noticed the existing market was filled with. And then I think fairness is probably the one that I like talking about the most. And to put that really simply, the existing systems are optimized for bums on seats. And so what that means is that you could have Peter working all day, every day on phones, or you could have Peter work a late shift followed by an early shift. And the existing system will allow that to happen because it optimizes to have the right number of people on phones, for example, without any regard for making sure that it's sustainable and frankly human in the way that it operates. Like, I think it very much treats people like resources, and you hear people refer to things as resource planning. And I remember the CEO of Bulb coming in and being like, can you just call them people? Like, we're managing humans. And I think that the systems that workforce management implement do switch cultures to thinking about people as fungible resources that can be optimized and moved around without actually realizing that there's a certain way that you have to respect boundaries with humans and making sure that they are treated in a fair and balanced way. So yeah, I think just with those three alone, it was sufficient evidence that something better had to be built, especially around simplicity, intelligence, and fairness. And that's where the inspiration came from and what we think the market is missing.
Well, it's really interesting. And I love how you talk about fairness, because to my mind, this is going to be very much a watchword as we move into 2022 and beyond. From the perspective of what a buyer should be looking for then as they are going out and shopping for a team planning solution, Natasha, are there any counsels that you would provide that they might be they might want to be prioritizing? Are there any red flags as a buyer might go out and try and shop around for one of these at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple of things come to mind. Number one is agility. Customer service is an industry that moves extremely rapidly. What holds customer service teams from being able to move rapidly is the systems they have implemented, because they could be wedded to those for decades and stuck to the way those systems operate without being able to do the best possible thing for the team. A great example of that, which I'm sure you hear every week, is the pandemic and how you have more and more teams working remotely, how that adjusted how teams organize themselves, how they adjust, how they organize, like which managers are managing which teams, who can work on what, who's online at what time, etc. And so using examples like that, you want a system where it's really easy to customize the settings. It's really easy to grow with the system, and it's really easy to adapt your systems as you change the systems. Again, as an example, like we see customers that might be using Twilio one day, they switch to Aircall. You want to make sure that your system is ready to handle that change and be able to implement in a way where, like, every time you add a new channel connector or a ticketing system, you're not having to reconfigure it from scratch and spend another like 3 months working on that. Onboarding, I guess, is the other one. Like, you don't want one that is a really slow, painful onboarding process. And then the final thing is ease of use. And ease of use can be important for a lot of obvious reasons, but I think what you want to avoid is you want to avoid having single points of failure in your organization where only 1 or 2 or 3 people know how to use the system, and then you become extremely reliant on information gathering from those people, having to make changes that affect the entire organization. You want a system that, frankly, like anybody who steps into the role can be using and be prepared to use from day one. And that comes from just simplicity and ease of use. And so I would really, really think, as you're procuring this type of software, like, can somebody who is brand new to the organization get up and running with the system? Can my organization grow with the system so we don't have to change it when we reach 100 people or 200 people or 500 people or 1,000 people? And also, like, what are the cultural implications that buying this type of software has on my organization? And that's where workforce management software can have negative cultural implications if it's bought poorly or executed poorly, because it can change agents from feeling like a really valued member of the team, where they're contributing to growth, they're contributing to retention, to having them feel like they're fungible resources that are just being moved around or optimized.
So one of the things I really appreciated on your website was the amount of thought leadership and the substance around that thought leadership that you've been able to recoup in terms of blogs and reports. Something that really caught my eye was the research that you did on shift work. Can you talk a little bit about what were some of the key findings and how good team planning solutions might have an impact with regards to shift work moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think shift working as it currently stands is something that we find an enormous misjustice in society right now. And so that comes from really basic things like how it's organized. And how it's organized could come down to how far in advance people get their shift plans. And there's studies that show, and our research also validated, that 40% of UK workers get their shift patterns less than a week in advance. And that comes down to the expectation that companies expect flexibility from their workers. They're not willing to give that flexibility in exchange. And looking at industries like customer service, you have a lot of people who are in education, whether it's full-time or part-time. You have people who could be working parents. All of that means that I think as employers and as a society, we have an expectation to make sure these systems are built and executed in a way that provides that transparency and then ability for people to plan their lives and their livelihood around other things that could be happening. And so we think that's a really big misjustice. I think around breaks and overtime, there were stats that we saw from our research that 61% of shift workers don't get paid breaks. And so that means that within their day, they might be getting 30 minutes off or something, and that won't be accounted for in their salary. Finally, 30% of shift workers are doing unpaid overtime. And so again, coming back to that one-way versus two-way flexibility, there's this expectation that workers have to give so much. They have to be prepared to do overtime. They may not be getting paid breaks, but on the other hand, if they're working overtime, they're also not getting paid for that. And so they're really losing out on both ends. And so these are things that we find extremely disappointing, extremely disheartening to read. And we ask ourselves the fundamental question, why is this happening? And for us, the answer comes down to, it's not that managers are like really evil gremlins who want to do this to their team. It's that the planning tools just don't make it easy. And so that's why we think that having a tool that's as simple as what we're trying to build at Surfboard should unlock opportunity to make all of this better. I think the final stat that I'd like to highlight from our research is that from all of these, I guess, like leading indicators from poor planning and last minute shift patterns, unpaid overtime, the final one is that over 70% of shift workers report that working shifts have affected their physical or mental health. And we think that's really strong culmination of just everything else that I quoted or cited, and the implications of poor planning and last minuteness, and not having financial security.
Natasha, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the CX Files today. It is always nice to hear some cutting edge research, which clearly Surfboard and yourself have undertaken. And it's great to see a fellow Canadian who is really shaking up the CX space. Congratulations. And we wish you and the entire team at Surfboard all the best in the future.
Thanks so much, Peter. It was great. It was great being here. And thanks for having me.
Anytime.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.